We've been waiting a really long time for Cyberpunk 2077, but it's almost here. By the time it's come out, it'll have been almost 8 years since the teaser trailer. And even longer if you're going by the announcement. I can't imagine how that feels for the people that have been waiting since day one. But for me, I think the first time I heard about Cyberpunk 2077 was after Witcher 3 came out and was making rounds in the news. Don't get me wrong, I was excited, but nowhere near to the level I am now. That was until 2017. This was back when there wasn't really much information on the game, and before the YouTube coverage had really taken off. Yet I still managed to come across lore videos on the channel Two Old Gamers. Suffice to say, it really got me interested in the genre, and shortly after, I started watching all the films and playing all the games, and just consuming all the cyberpunk media I could get my hands on. Like I'm sure many of you have to try and fill that void in the meantime. But more importantly, I've been creating a document outlining some of the ideas I'd like to see in my ideal cyberpunk, and I thought I'd go through and break down some of the highlights. And hey, by chance we might even see some of them end up in cyberpunk. And with just so much excitement around the game, I thought it'd be fun just to have somewhere where we can just speculate and discuss. And while it's great to be excited for the game, it's also equally important to keep your expectations grounded in reality. Not that this video is going to help with that. And I have been working on this video over a process of a while, so some of this stuff we do have more information on now. So it'll be interesting looking back on this in the future and seeing how close or far off it ends up being. And without further ado, let's roll the intro.
Seen things you people wouldn't believe.
Looking back at Cyberpunk's teaser trailer from 2013, it's evident that a lot has changed, and the 2077 that we see is a lot more futuristic than the one we have today. With these seemingly endless buildings in all directions with interconnecting sky bridges between them. A possible reason for this might be, to quote from the one and only MrBtongue in his video Cyberpunk is Back, he puts forward the idea the nearer the setting to current day, the closer today's hot button issues are, which carries along with it a much larger inherent risk. So expect themes like class divide and inequality in income, Orwellian authoritarian states, invasions of privacy and mass surveillance, from megacorporations pulling the strings from behind the shadows, whilst anarchistic anti-authoritarian riots litter the streets, and advancements in technology leading to transhumanism, begging the question what it means to be human. I think it's for good reason that we saw this shift in setting. Things seem much more varied and arguably much more interesting. It's a great video, his channel is definitely worth checking out. I'll make sure to leave a link to his channel down in the description. With all that being said, it's interesting to think what other design decisions could have been affected by the change in setting, and wonder how different the game might have been compared to the one we see today. I was really surprised when CD Projekt confirmed that the game was going to be open world. For the level of detail needed for a dystopian city, I thought for sure that the game was going to be made up of lots of individual spaces, where you're not held down by many of the constraints that you are with open worlds, like getting everything to fit together and having seamless transitions between areas. Not to say I'm against open worlds, I love the level of immersion added when you're not interrupted by any loading screens, but I'm still a bit cautious by how many times I've been burned by bad open worlds in titles where they don't belong. Rage 2 and Mirror's Edge Catalyst come to mind. And with memory budgets and data streaming limits, there are valid concerns of performance, especially so on last gen, which was reportedly the cause of delay. But to put worries aside, This is the team that brought us Novigrad, and by the trailers, the wizards over at CDPR have seemingly managed density and scale, hopefully without having to sacrifice either, all whilst not running like a slideshow. Then on top of that, when you've got to also account for driving as well, things get exponentially more complex when you have to try and have seemingly enough places to explore on foot and by car at the same time. I think a game that strikes this balance well has to be Sleeping Dogs, with its dense little pockets of walking areas broken up by a network of roads. And this being CDPR's first time at attempting driving in a game, I just hope they manage to get that feel right. For inspiration, I hope they look to the first Forza Horizon game, which balances that feeling of being arcadey and realistic nicely. And not only is this their first time having driving in a game, it's also their first time featuring shooting, unless you count Saints Row 2's PC port, which I think CDPR would rather forget. But this being their first go at it, I just hope that they give us the options to configure different aspects to our liking, like controls for dead zones, acceleration amounts, response curves, auto-aim amounts, and independent character FOV, so we can tailor the experience to be best for us. So it has been confirmed that there's going to be 6 different districts in Night City. That got me to thinking what kind of areas I'd like to see, and I managed to come up with 5. First of which being, so this is probably what comes to mind when you think of Cyberpunk, the classic Blade Runner look, which to me breaks down into 2 major inspirations, the first of which being the noir film period from the 1940s and 50s, usually taking place in the large Art Deco cities of New York, Chicago and Detroit, which is why you see things like old cage elevators and Venetian blinds and fire escape balconies, and lots of brick, things you wouldn't usually associate with the future, and the other half coming from Asian influences, with technology and neon signs of course, to simplify things greatly. Hopefully is what we're likely to see in the downtown, Little China and Japantown areas, just so there's somewhere you can feel like a Blade Runner when you're walking around on a rainy night. The next idea I came up with I'd like to see in the centre of Night City maybe? Somewhere that acts as a contrast from the grimy streets and alleyways of the downtown, and replaces it with white clinical buildings with glass facades and accents of wood laminates, where your light covering overpasses are replaced by high-tech, air-filtering suspended tunnels, and high-rise skyscrapers litter the skies, acting as landmarks to orientate your navigation off. Where inside, corporate suits spend their times in office cubicles, doing whatever it takes to climb the corporate ladder, whilst their corrupt executives spend their nights in lavish parties in their rooftop penthouses. This would have a distinctive feel compared to the other districts, where you could have things like parks and maybe the only state-of-the-art mall to be found, which would be full of advertisements showing how egregious consumerism has got. It could be the only place you can find all the different types of merchants near each other, maybe with a built-in aquarium and an arena for some kind of Running Man-esque blood sports, where one of the exits of the mall could lead onto a casino area, and with gambling follows the seedy underbelly of organised crime, which could operate the sleazy red light district nearby. A place where billowing factories line the sky, and the area in a thick smog. This is what I imagine for the industrial era. It'd be cool if we could explore maybe half a dozen factories, each with their own assembly lines with their own themes and gimmicks, whether through main or side quests, or just as you're exploring the world, as well as adding to the world building. Maybe we could have an old abandoned nuclear factory that you could have a side quest where maybe one of the gangs has moved in and got it operational, and then one of the options could lead you to blowing up Night City or something and then troll you with the credits, and then reload a save. That would be pretty funny. In terms of other industrial areas, it'd be great to see some kind of docks, seeing massive futuristic cargo ships and automated cranes pulling around containers all day would be cool to experience. And double jumping around between the containers would make for good combat. It'd also be cool to see some high-rise construction areas, which is probably what the Pacifica area is going to look like, where you could traverse up and down levels and navigate on scaffolding and frames between buildings, all whilst being in the middle of a firefight. I can imagine the sound of the building swaying in the howling winds up there. You could also have it where enemies try and drop items from above you, or you could try and push stuff on the enemies below you. Just remember to not look up. On the complete other side of things, we've got the underground, made up from a maze-like network of tunnels, from small local sewers that can act as a quick getaway, to massive storm drains, like the ones found in Mirror's Edge, which were inspired from the real-life storm drains found in Tokyo. It could also lay home to an outcast group or those on the run, or even have a bunch of mutants caused by some toxic green waste if you wanted to go full-on cartoon with it. It could also be a good way to add some more enemy variety, that could run a bunch of underground races, or have a coliseum and a fight ring. And I'd love to see the inclusion of like a monster mystery for the community to try and come together and solve. Like people thought there was in GTA 5, but there ended up not being anything. We've already seen a bunch of ARGs for the lead up of Cyberpunk, so I wouldn't just put aside the possibility yet. After spending all your time in the city, how cool would it be for like a part in the third act where you have to leave the sanctuary of the city and travel a desolate wasteland where you wander until signs of plant life become much more sparse and man-made structures even more so, until eventually you find it, or more accurately, they find you. A Mad Max-esque gang of raiders to add a bit of post-apocalyptic to your cyberpunk. Skill systems. Every game seems to have them these days, but only a few of them seem to do them well, and there's a few common mistakes shared between them, so let's go over them. I think a good skill system should have an extensive choice of options, so when it comes to expressing your character, you have what you need to make your ideal character and playstyle. Whether you want to be a glass cannon or a tank, or something in between, you should always be able to find something to your liking. One of these issues we see is games having overly complex progression systems. This is in a lot of old RPGs, CRPGs and MMOs, where things are just excessively complex for complexity's sake. In the case of MMOs, this is done to keep player attention up, to try and generate more revenue. But in the broader sense, a great indication of this is when games have multiple progression systems, where things feel convoluted and almost always ends up feeling homogenized, compared to if it only had one strong one, at least in my experience, as well as usually being unclear in what a certain skill gives you. And then on the other side of things, you've got games with a too simple system, where it feels like you've got nothing to sink your teeth into, and things don't go much deeper than the surface level, where any form of skill tree comes off over-organised and already outlined for you, with not much room for experimentation. So there's not that incentive for your players to delve that little bit further to min-max their characters. Not all games get it right, and I'm sure it can be hard to strike that balance. Another thing is synergies, which is when you find two complementary skills, what I think should be in all skill trees, which are a great way of imbuing meaning into your choices, which as a player give you that great moment of feeling like you've gained the system, like you found some unintended combo. Another thing you need to make sure is that you're disincentivizing a jack of all trades build. A great way of doing this is skewing your more powerful skills to the top of the trees, where they require more of an investment, but you don't want to overdo it, where every other skill feels redundant in comparison. And then you have some games with just way too many skills. If you can't notice a tangible difference before and after a skill, in its specific use scenario, is it really worth including? A great solution for this would be combining multiple rewards together in one neat package. Another thing, if you've got one skill that feels overpowered, instead of just taking away from it, sometimes it can be more interesting to add a negative downside instead, which is a great way of reinforcing its purpose. With all this in mind, I decided to try and come up with some skills of my own. Starting off with health. Is it just me, or does every game seem to have the same health mechanic these days? Every time you get hit, you have to go cower behind cover while you wait for your health to regen. I don't know about you, but that sounds like probably the most least appealing thing you could have someone do in these games. It's only been in recent years that we've started to see games that break this formula, a la your Doom Eternals and Rage 2s of the world, with their more aggressive push-forward combat. So I'd like to see more games experiment with different health mechanics. So you could see things like skills that disable health regeneration and make it based on pickups. Payday 2 is another game with its perk decks, with its ideas like dodge, giving a percentage chance to every bullet based on your movement. You could flip ideas on their heads. Let's say so having an enemy melee you gives you a buff instead. You could have shields that act as extra health bars that regen faster, and armor that could give you a damage absorption amount, or even something like a shield overcharge that could deflect damage back at enemies. I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but these kind of things will fit right in an RPG. You could have skills for mobility, which opens you up to loads of different options for skills. You could have double jumps and triple triple jumps, a jetpack, sliding, wall running. What we saw in the 48-minute demo but has sadly been removed since. Dashing, slamming, and there should be options on the other side as well if you want to be a immobile tank, like maybe latching yourself to the ground for decreased recoil, regenerating ammo, or deflecting projectiles. You could also tie HUD options behind skills, things like grenade and damage indicators, grenade throwing arcs, floating damage numbers and health bars. By tying these to skills, you make them optional, so whether you want to have a clean immersive HUD or as much information as possible, it's your choice, and that way the disadvantage for not having it goes away along with it, because you've saved a skill point or two, unlike some option buried under free menus. You could even tie navigation to this sort of thing, with compasses and mini-maps and map markers. By making it a part of the skills, they would have to ensure that the game was entirely playable without any navigational aids. CDPR already talked about how they named every individual street and location in their Night City Wire 3. All they'd have to make sure is that NPCs gave out adequate directions, and you would be able to play the game entirely without a HUD. Now, while this approach wouldn't fit every game, I personally think would feel really immersive in Cyberpunk. And speaking of immersion, one of the biggest killers of immersion for me has to be obtrusive HUD elements that take up screen real estate and obscuring your view, taking you out of the experience. So I'd really like to see the inclusion of a dynamic HUD that would hide certain HUD elements when they're not in use, like your health bar when you're not in combat. Or another approach that you could do with the minimap. If we do have to follow markers, I'd love to see them projected over the game world, rather than having to glare up in the top corner at the minimap every couple of seconds, so I can spend more time marveling the world that they've painstakingly created. You could also have skills for stealth, but I think you get the idea. I think in the actual game it won't be as out there as the ideas that I've presented here, but should be more than enough with a reported 250 skills. When it comes to setting the atmosphere, audio is half the experience. That's why the right choice of music is so important, and a great way of achieving that we've seen in more recent years is game companies collaborating with independent record labels and artists. This approach has produced gems such as Ruiner, Zero Katana, Fury, My Friend Pedro, and Hotline Miami. All examples from the last decade alone. And in terms of genres we're likely to see in Cyberpunk, the first one to come up is likely to be synthwave. I personally believe synthwave fits more of a retro-futuristic outrun aesthetic. A better fitting genre would have to be dark synth for me, which is actually a subgenre of synthwave, as well as recent EBM, which could be in the clubs, mid-tempo, which could be the combat music, and maybe some dark ambient IDM for exploration. Really anything that sounds dystopian, industrial, and mechanical, including such artists like Fool, Lorne, Danger, and Gesaffelstein. If you have no idea what artists and genres I'm referring to here, or simply want to find one of the songs in this video, you can check out my Cyberpunk Spotify playlist, which you can find links to down in the description. There's been a lot of disagreement over whether or not CDPR's choice of setting the game in a primarily first-person perspective was the right one or not. Now ultimately I think they made the right decision with focusing on first person, as it reinforces your state of character, as well as for moments when you like get your eyes taken out or you're being hacked and there's lots of visual artifacts all over your screen. But I still can't deny how awesome it would have been if you were to be able to strut through a crowd where the camera just surfs above the surface. There was a bit of confusion whether or not the perspective choice extended to cutscenes as well, but now we know thanks to the Tools of Destruction trailer that they will be included. We already know that Cyberpunk, being an RPG, it's gonna have a lot of choices to make, with the Maelstrom mission from the trailers apparently containing 7 different outcomes, so we're already good on that. Personally, something that I want to see is more reactivity from things you wouldn't expect. For a great example we can actually take directly from the game, content creators that got to play the game early shared on that in the scene where you have to lay a body down for trauma team, if you actually get too close, you would actually get pushed by them, as well as little things like staring at NPCs will provoke them. Hopefully this indicates some fairly advanced AI, which seems to be a sorely underappreciated field in games, with the last improvements in AI coming from as far back as Fear 1 from 2005, with its GOAP system or Go-Orientated Action Planning, or even Halo 2 with its behaviour trees. Anyway, tangent over. I hope these little emergent scenarios aren't a rare occurrence, I would love to see this kind of level of detail used behind your choices by adding complex mechanics with non-deterministic triggers so you don't know what causes an outcome. To give one example, like using stat-influenced RNG to calculate timers for triggering different scripts like dialogue or a cinematic, or even things like for where enemies spawn, or their amounts or their locations, to add replayability by not making it the same every time. Where a bunch of different values like how many questions have you asked, previous choices values, did you close that door, did you loot that corpse, did you find that item, or up to 2 or 3 of these could be used to calculate quest outcomes. But it's probably something that we're still a few years off from. But used all over the game, these little details would add up and make the game feel really immersive. This could also be tied into dialogue, where every time you bump into an NPC with a dialogue check, you'd receive a debuff affecting the chance for that next dialogue check. Or this could also happen every time an NPC makes a remark when you take too long to reply. But my main issue with dialogue skill checks is how they all boil down to one click and they're instantly convinced scenario, where instead it should be like an actual conversation with a back and forth. Multiple stages, each with their own set of options, where you have to pick your words carefully to slowly convince them to your side. Similar to the way seen in the Deus Ex reboots, but hopefully not just for your main quests. But you can't really discuss dialogue choices and RNG without acknowledging save reload abusing, also known as save scumming. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say we're all guilty of it at least once. And who can blame us when it's just so easy to do? Now, thinking of ways to fix this, you could disable the option to save outright, but that would be pretty inconvenient. So an alternative I see to this would be if these roles were pre-calculated with a hidden trigger before they come up. To conclude, we have games that have great RPG mechanics, great worlds to explore, and games with visceral combat. But a game that can combine all 3 of them is something we don't see very often. And that's ultimately my hopes for Cyberpunk 2077, that it can in a cohesive experience. Now we just have to wait and see how it really is. Thanks for watching.